The state. I have described what I think property and ownership are based on, and from now on will no longer regularly deal at that low level of abstraction. I am boxing this concept. So instead of saying Bob owns a shirt according to the relevant subjects around him, I will just say Bob owns a shirt. If a conflict ever arises as to who owns what, I will unbox the concept and deal with ownership at the more basic level. Now the state needs to be defined. The state is an entity which exerts a measure of de jure authority over an area it has not acquired ownership of via the commonly agreed upon criteria of ownership for non-state agents. Or more succinctly, it is a land monopoly that stems from a double standard in the criteria of ownership. For example, while you may have to build up so many improvements per acre or farm land for a period of time, the state can just pass an act through Congress and declare 10,000 acres as wetland preserve or national park land, and they can make you pay rent on land that you supposedly own. Right? They call this rent property tax. The state is made up of people like a company, and these people rotate in and out, and after many years you can have a completely different set of people who make up the same state. And the state is typically an institution. I do not feel compelled to address more exotic states. Just a note here, an example of a more exotic state would be like an individual man who is viewed as the state, and when he dies, the state dies. Or a religious cult that believes everyone in the world should make some sacrifice to the gods, and so the people force them to do so, even though there is no formal institution carrying out the coercion. For now, I'm just dealing with things like the United States or Canada or Germany or something. For example, a claims association only deals with land its members are living on. All land not being homesteaded by members of the claims association is not claimed by the claims association. If one wishes to live just outside the property of a person, a part of the claims association, they will do so. A state, however, will claim a large body of land and issue a fiat decree, perhaps a property tax. That is, by living on the land claimed by whoever makes up the state, you are said to be living within the borders of X state and are subject to the laws and taxes of that state. The state does not acquire property in the same way non-state subjects do, and this can get fuzzy in theory, but in practice it is not ambiguous as to what is and what isn't a state. For example, females may have different things they have to do to acquire ownership of land than men, but it would be silly to then say that women or men are now the state. The ability of the state to issue decrees pertaining to anyone living in the area over their claim is based primarily on belief, the ideology of the state as being legitimate. This is not to say that individuals will like the state any more than they will like respecting the property of some crank, but that they will view such things as legitimate. Belief is what maintains private property, and private property is necessary for the buildup of capital and people producing things that people want. Belief is also what maintains the state, which I consider a perversion of this belief structure. Through a value-free analysis, though a value-free analysis would conclude that a state is just another type of intersubjective consensus of ownership, which it is, but it is a highly destructive type. But when looking at what constitutes ownership, we see that what is a state is in fact not something different in kind, which is why the state cannot be apodictically defined, but only relatively defined. And practically speaking, it is easy to spot states. The fuzziness is only theoretical. When one says, "we are the state," this is what they mean. It's not true, you are not the state, but the state is considered legitimate because it is part of the intersubjective consensus of that which is valid. Many mistakenly view the state as part of them. We are the state, especially if they themselves believe in the legitimacy of the state. My opinion is that the state is a perversion of the tendency among many species to assign ownership of property to individuals. For a state to come about in the first place, people must believe in ownership, because without ownership, how can an institution of the institution of the state be said to have typically limited ownership over such vast territories that they have never touched? It cannot. And this is why many anarchists want to abolish private property altogether. That is, they want to drive private property out of the intersubjective consensus worldwide. Now, this cannot be done, as private property is crucial for a sustainable structure of production to form. Just a note here, historically anarchists have been against all land ownership. This stems from a correct analysis that the state can only exist when there is a belief in property. And when the anarchists rail against those decent but misguided chaps who call themselves market anarchists, saying that market anarchists aren't real anarchists, they're mostly correct. But the existence of cancer doesn't mean we should abandon cell structure, and the existence of the state doesn't mean we should abandon property ownership. And property in this context means things like land and buildings, not what are subjectively defined as personal possessions, like you can't homestead your toothbrush. End note. An analogy would be that one shouldn't cease to be offended by grotesque injustice just because he realizes that ethics are contrived. Within the Claims Association, there may be individuals who greatly object to the rules of the Claims Association. An objecting individual may lobby to get those rules changed and succeed or fail to acquire individualistic concessions from the Claims Association or whatever. If he is unable to acquire concessions from the relevant agents of the Claims Association and still tries to start, for example, a pig farm, and the pig farm smells really bad, not like haha who farted bad, more like I can't even think bad. If he tries to start a pig farm, he will face force from whoever is assigned to use force against those who shirk the decrees of the association. Thus, force is used at the margins of the Claims Association. One could call the folks assigned to violently enforce the rules of the association the marginal association, and the people who founded and convinced/continue to convince people to join the association as the ideological association. One could accuse me of overanalyzing the Claims Association here, as in the past they typically consisted of part-time bureaucrats who managed collective affairs once a month, but I'm doing this for a reason. God damn it. Okay, I'm back. Where am I? Where was I? Okay. However, if an individual holds sufficient antipathy towards the rules of that association, he will most likely leave. Either he will leave the geographic area of the association member's property, or he will trade land with someone on the geographic fringe of the association and secede from the association that way. You know, fill in the technicalities as you will, and please spare the world and your mind of silly thoughts about encirclement scenarios. For example, a guy buying all the land surrounding someone and saying, you cannot pass unless you pay $1 million toll. Right? And the way you deal with that is the relevant population just won't honor the property, or will demand that the guy grant easement. One cannot leave or secede from the state as it stands. The way we know this is that the bulk of the population of the planet hasn't seceded from various states, or at least a sizable portion has not. The state is maintained the same way the Claims Association is maintained, primarily through ideology, right, the belief in the state as legitimate, and through force on the margins. The vast majority of people view the state as legitimate. Some may not like Bush or Obama for whatever reason and say, he's not my president, but they are not saying that the United States government, as an institution through time, is illegitimate. And supporters of the state need not be gung-ho patriotic flag worshippers or Constitution fetishizers, but can be resigned to the state as some inevitable law of nature, like death and taxes, and view it as a necessary evil, saying that something like, yeah, I hate taxes as much as the next guy, but the roads have got to get built somehow. Yep. But more detail is necessary for this. But for now, let's just work from the point that the vast majority, say 98% of people in the area claimed by the United States federal government, believe the state is legitimate. So the vast majority supports the state and pays taxes, which enables the state to hire soldiers and police. I'm not saying that the state police are completely worthless. That is another issue for another section. But police can be called upon to put the screws to tax resistors. If a person avoids paying taxes, he will get hit with a late penalty. If he refuses to pay the late penalty plus the tax, he will then have a trial where the legitimacy of the state is presupposed and will then be sentenced to prison. If he resists being sentenced to prison, and that means with guns, like people coming, like SWAT team coming to his house saying you got to go to prison, and it's like, hey, you're foreign invaders invading my property, I'm not going. If he resists with guns, he will be killed by the state police force, and the state policeman will say something like, well, I was just enforcing the law, and in the process of enforcing the law, they, I defended myself from this violent tax evader or something like that. And then the policeman put a bullet in his head. That is the marginal state. And that is how cracks in the ideological state are prevented from forming. Because if anyone was allowed to secede, then you would have cascading secession, right? Which is a few trailblazers would step out into the boogeyman world of anarchy, and it'd be fine. And then a few more would leave, and soon only the most deranged cultists would continue to cling to the state. And so to prevent this, the state cannot afford to let a single man secede, really, lest the others start getting ideas. Killing tax resistors doesn't happen very often, because when most receive a fine, they pay it. And most humans have a revulsion against killing, and so any state agency that killed a tax resistor would not be very popular. And state agents themselves are humans and typically have a few smoldering embers of compassion that can get through the schadenfreude against state-defined criminals. What's more is that repeated use of force destroys the ideology. It weakens the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of citizens. States which repeatedly use force on their citizens are weak states, because it means that a large percentage of the people are kept in line by force alone and don't believe in the ideology, right? They have to keep taking the guns out because the population doesn't believe in the state. And this is what I call a high percentage marginal state. Lots of guns coming out because people don't believe in it. A man holding up a bank and holding up everyone inside as a hostage would be a 100% marginal state. Note, Stockholm Syndrome is an example of the ideological state forming after a long occupation. This can and did happen, and it is how states expand. But even this expansion, force converting into ideological support, is not done by force alone. It requires ideological support somewhere. Typically, a state has ideological support in one area and taxes this area, and then suppresses another. The suppression funded by taxes from the homeland, which has ideological support. I apologize for the cliche metaphor, but this is similar to the sheep and the sheepdog. If a flock of sheep were to all rush against the sheepdog and the herder in a uniform attack, the sheepdog and the farmer would be overwhelmed. A few sheep may die, and if this were the movie Babe, those sheep would be remembered as like martyrs of the revolution. Without belief in either the legitimacy or overwhelming force of the sheepdog, the sheep would go their own way. And even with the belief, a few sheep will stray, right? And that's why you need the sheepdog or the herder to herd the sheep back into the flock, right? The sheepdog patrols the margins and uses the force and the threat of force, barking at the margins to keep the sheep back in line. Now, I haven't gone much into the utilitarian superiority of a stateless society, or even how various sundries would be managed: roads, defense, safety and health regulations, police and law, scientific research, humanitarian services, the monetary system, etc. But I just wanted to lay out the very basics: how ownership works, how associations work, and how the state works in a basic sense. Also, hopefully, if one internalizes this basic fact, he will see that at the bottom of it all, the state is a death cult, and that one should not be so casual in advocating state action, because by doing so you are advocating death threats. That is, you are arranging and pointing the guns in certain directions to achieve the desired results, even though most are trained to not see the guns.